reaction to a podcast. Mikey Musumeci at Joe Rogan. Mikey Musumeci is a submission grappler, so he's a jiu-jitsu practitioner, and he was featured on the Joe Rogan podcast. I want to discuss Mikey. He's a very interesting individual, and I think there's a couple of things to learn from him. He's 25 years old, in my opinion, the most interesting no-gi or gi grappler. Well, let's just call it jiu-jitsu practitioner. It doesn't mean gi, no-gi. These things are not that important. What's important is his approach towards the sport, his approach towards the art. There's obviously Gordon Ryan also, who's a top-notch practitioner, and there's a couple of others. But this is not about jiu-jitsu here. This is about Mikey and his approach towards life and his approach towards the craft. I think there's a couple of things to learn here. The most important takeaway from this is the following: that I'm kind of trying to think a little bit to change my approach when it comes to working and when it comes to doing almost anything. And the approach, I call it drilling. So instead of working like most people, or I think at least I was raised like that you grow up learning things, and then you apply these things to, let's say, problems. So that's kind of how, I guess, you go to school, you learn all your stuff, you work somewhere, and then you apply knowledge, skill to problems, and you solve problems. And I think Mikey's approach is very different. Mikey's 25 years old. I think he hasn't lost this jiu-jitsu fight forever, and he's winning against top-notch state, top of the food chain type competitors. He's now part of the One Championship tour, where they just introduced submission grappling division. So it's like the UFC, but think of it like they have MMA, they have kickboxing, and then they have also now submission grappling. And so he's the first in his weight division that won the belt there against really top-notch competition. I don't know the details. I don't know these other names, but needless to say, people like Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman, people that I know follow the sport very closely, are in awe with this kid. Gordon Ryan actually is in awe. So you don't need more credentials than that when it comes to jiu-jitsu. So having said that, what's so special about this kid? I think the one thing that I absolutely resonate with him is that he looks at his training as a drilling process. What do I mean with drilling? Drilling is you look at a certain position in jiu-jitsu, and then you try to solve the problem. So let's say there's a certain attack that you want to defend. Let's say somebody wants to knee slide and break your guard. And then you look at this and you work with your partner towards trying to defend that particular position. So your whole training is really geared towards solving problems, towards reacting to an attack or reacting to a defense if you want to be the attacker. And to me, it made me think, why don't I look at life like that? Unfortunately, I'm not able to train jiu-jitsu anymore, so I can't go to the mat and train. I have a knee problem, and I think I decided not to get involved in the sport anymore actively. But I can use some of the techniques still for, let's say, the way I work. Why am I always thinking sort of in absolute terms, learning things and then trying to apply them to specific problems? Why don't I just look at specific problems and very specifically, let's say, work out skills to solve the problem? Why don't I do that? Why don't I invest in time and resources and energy to attack a certain problem? So, for example, when maybe the right way to think about it is something along the lines of trying to debate situations in life. So trying to debate instead of just arguing. What's the difference between arguing and debate? Arguing is you're trying to convince somebody else that you're right, and somebody else trying to convince you that you're right. But in jiu-jitsu, that's not how it works. In jiu-jitsu, it's not about you convincing me. It's about you either submit me or I submit you. That's it. So I think I want to look at life and, let's say, my work in more that context. So when I write my essays, basically my first takeaway is that maybe I should start with my essays before I do the podcast. But like, my essays shouldn't be about, let's say, knowledge that I expose to the world. How about it's more of a drilling process where I drill through a problem. Let's say the problem of, one of my essays, academia adopts the language of cowards. So what's the exact problem? What's the attack? The attack is that wokeism is trying to coerce us into a certain types of thinking, and they're using academia as a Trojan horse. That's the attack. So how can we defend this attack? So that will be, let's say, an interesting way to approach. What are the defenses? And if we do, let's say, if we say, well, this is against freedom, then they will say, well, you're just a right wing. So think of it more like a jiu-jitsu move where they attack you. Jiu-jitsu is about reaction. It's all about reaction. Jiu-jitsu is game theory in action. So they make a move, you make a move, they make a move. How about I start thinking more along those lines? Tesla is losing market share in China. That's an attack. So how can I respond? If I was Tesla, what would I do? And if I lower prices, what is BYD gonna do? If they do, let's say, lower prices, what are my responses? Think along, try to think more like that in general. I think it's going to be useful. I think Mikey has inspired me, and this is what I want to talk about this today. This is a Not Even Wrong podcast. It's January 9th, 2023. This is Krimdelko. For the day, the fund is up roughly 7%. The market is up 0.5%. For the year, we're flat. The market's up 2%. The markets are still open. Tesla is recovering. That's the main reason. But I want to talk about Mikey now and not spend too much time. I'm going to maybe do another podcast today or tomorrow discussing the situation in China more thoroughly. And after I've also done some more work and maybe apply this technique also in terms of more, like I said, drilling versus just giving general knowledge. But let's focus now on Mikey. So Mikey Musumeci is a submission grappler, 25 years old, world champion, unbelievably good at what he does. I think what's really exciting about this boy is that the fact that he approaches life as a drill. So he trains 12 hours a day, self-proclaimed, and what does drilling really do? Drilling means, in jiu-jitsu, it means that you expose yourself to certain situations and then you try to solve the problem. So like I said, let's say there's a knee slide that tries to break your guard, and then you try to defend that, and you keep drilling with your partner or partners constantly. Why don't you do this? Try that. What if I stretch my arm? What if I move my elbow a little bit? And these are two things. First, while you're doing this, you're learning potentially new moves. You're learning how to use your body leverage in a different way to defend that particular attack. But more importantly, also, of course, it starts ingraining your response into your muscle memory, so you don't have to think while in a fight because you don't have that time. Of course, it has to be muscle memory. So this concept of drilling, I think I'd be interested in hearing neuroscientists maybe discuss it also more thoroughly, because I feel that there's something about the way we learn as humans. It's all about iteration, right? It's iteration, error correction. So these things are ingrained. We've spoken about this many times here at the Not Even Wrong podcast. We're big proponents when it comes to that. So the scientific process is nothing but iteration and error correction. But let's get back to the drilling point. I feel like what's interesting about drilling is why are we not approaching everything in life as a drill? Why just jiu-jitsu? Why just science? Why is not everything iterative? And what I mean with that is, let's say if I discuss, for example, my essay, when academia adopts the language of cowards, right? So I talk about the problem that we have wokeism penetrating academia and is a Trojan horse for collectivist freedom, encumbering type of forces in our society. We are, we're a society that's based on voluntary interaction and the freedom of expression, and those things are under threat. They've been under threat before. With COVID, they've become even more threatened. So that's the attack. How do we defend that? And then if we defend that in a certain way, then the others, let's just call it the academic industrial complex, is going to react to that. So how about we look at this problem from a drilling perspective? They attack, we react, or from a game theory perspective, if you want a bit more of an economic term. That's the idea. That's what Mikey really inspired me to do, and I'm going to try to do that going forward. So, but again, this episode is actually about discussing this person and the podcast that I thought was very interesting. And here's another thing which is very interesting about Mikey Musumeci, is that he has a very unorthodox training style, lifestyle in general. Let's say he says, self-proclaimed, he only trains with hobbyists. So he doesn't actually train with top-notch athletes. And why does he train with hobbyists? Because he feels like hobbyists are people that show up voluntarily. It's not their work. And everything the boy does, I mean, I shouldn't call him boy, he's 25 years old, and he would probably, break my limbs or choke me if he wanted to. So he's a pretty serious assassin. Nevertheless, he has this approach of a nerd.
He's soft when it comes to the way he talks. He's got a soft demeanor. He has a kind of a nerdy appearance. He doesn't feel like this tough jiu-jitsu guy by no means. But then on the mat, he's an assassin. His whole jiu-jitsu game is, how can I get your leg and finish you? And if I don't get your leg, how can I get something else and go towards the finish? What strikes me most about Mikey, though, is his joy. The joy. You can feel that he enjoys this discipline. He enjoys the drill. He enjoys the training.
Why is it so important? Because I think joy and skill and drilling are very highly interconnected. If you drill something and learn through drilling, I think you're getting the dopamine of succeeding, let's say, in defending a certain attack, and the dopamine gives you the joy. Versus if you learn, let's say, jiu-jitsu, the way I've learned it, unfortunately, I was in a somewhat generic jiu-jitsu environment where you just do the classes every day, half-hour warm-up, half-hour technique, half-hour rolling, every day the same, boring. They did introduce drilling, but they didn't really. It was more one of those things where you had to have friends and then drill with them. And there were some groups that actually did it, a group of Brazilians. They showed up all the time and drilled, and that was great and good for them. And I just wasn't lucky enough to have that kind of environment. So I was more exposed to the generic type of people that showed up every day and didn't really know what to do with themselves and all of that stuff. So when you learn things from sort of, I call it the top down, you learn a few things, but a lot of things fall through the cracks. When you learn it bottom up, and bottom up is the drilling. When you learn, when a problem is attacked, let's say, well, this was pun intended, I guess. When you approach a problem through an attack and defense, when you look at everything in life, even, the question of, let's say, in this particular case, wokeism penetrating the academic industrial complex, if you consider this an attack and now what's your defense and then what's their attack, if you consider it from that perspective, I think it becomes more interesting, and I think you have the chance to maybe create more dopamine. Because in the end, it looks like when we humans do things, we should maximize the release of dopamine. That's my point. I mean, that's what Mike is really saying I only do things that I enjoy. He's saying, I enjoy eating food, pizza and pasta. That's my enjoyment in life, and it's sustainable. It's sustainable. What does that all mean? It just means that, listen, this is maximizing my dopamine. Most people maximize the dopamine by, doing drugs. I mean, not most, but some, or definitely most people maximize dopamine by, watching movies and TikTok and stuff like that, which is fine. But how about we channel the dopamine maximization into our work, into our skill set? Because I feel like generating skills, solving problems. This is, by the way, very close to what David Deutsch once said. The one sentence that made me interested in David Deutsch was when he said, humans enjoy solving problems. And I woke up, I kind of thought when I scratched my head, I said, oh, this is an interesting concept. So joy is solving problems. It's very, very close to what Mikey Musumeci is saying. And he says, when I drill 12 hours a day, I don't even notice it. Why? Because I solve problems. Solving problems is joy. Why is it so? Because solving a problem gives me dopamine. So how about I look at things in life in general? Again, my work, which is deploying capital towards fundamentally new concepts in engineering practice. How about I look at it from a sort of attack defense type perspective, and I look at life more as a drill, and then hopefully I generate dopamine while I'm doing it. So the purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense of what it feels like to run a hedge fund, right? So why am I talking about dopamine? Why am I talking about joy? Well, one of the most important questions is, well, how can I be motivated to do what I do, and how can I do better? And this is the answer. I think Mikey Musumeci gave me a bit of an inspiration of how to get better at what I do, which is look at life more as a drill. My work life as a sort of attack defense type problem solving process. I think it's an interesting process. I'm going to work more on this. I'm going to try to write my essays in that sense. And I hope to give people a little bit of inspiration. If you have time, look at Mikey Musumeci's videos, look at the Joe Rogan interview. It's interesting. It's really worth it. Don't think too much about jiu-jitsu. If you're not a jiu-jitsu practitioner, it doesn't matter. What's another interesting thing about Mikey is I think he's rubbing people off the wrong way. Why? Because I feel like he's so unorthodox, and a lot of the establishment doesn't like that, which is another very interesting thing. Try to do things differently. If you do things differently, your chances of success are much higher than if you do it the same way like everybody else is doing it. The risks are higher too, but the chances are also much higher. To summarize, I'm discussing Mikey Musumeci, a very interesting 25-year-old submission grappler, very successful. What's really interesting about him is his different approach towards training, towards life in general. And I think it can be summarized as he looks at life as a drill, and a drill that is maximizing for dopamine. In other words, the drilling, the getting better at skills is generating joy, and joy is making it a lot better and easier for him to be successful at what he does. That's the inspiration. That's why I think Mikey Musumeci is worth just looking at. He's a phenomenal fighter also, but what's really exciting is his excellence at his art is inspirational. And I think if you look at life more as a drilling process, at least your work life, but you can even extrapolate this to the rest of your life. If you look at what you actually do on a daily basis as a drill, solving problems from an attack defense perspective, you will generate more dopamine. In other words, you have more joy, and that's going to make you better. Thank you.